Let's cultivate our motivation. So after a very rich week of doing retreat and having many teachings and much time to contemplate, we're now back on our usual schedule and we're studying a different topic. We're doing the debate topic tonight. So the material is quite different than the retreat, and it requires a different type of listening and a different kind of mindfulness and attention. Nevertheless, no matter what Dharma topic we're studying, let's have the same motivation for studying all of them, because they all, in one way or another, will improve our mind, increase our intelligence and our compassion, so that we can progress on the path and be of increased service to sentient beings. So even though the topic is different, the way we listen is different, the motivation and the purpose is the same. So let's cultivate that bodhicitta motivation. Okay, so the stuff on the retreat was not too difficult to understand, but we're coming back to the debate topic, and we may have to put more energy into this to understand it. But like I said, the purpose of learning it is the same, and this will challenge us in another way. But to become a fully awakened being, we need to develop many parts of ourselves. It's not sufficient to develop just one part. His Holiness always says that we shouldn't be like the old people eating food, where they eat just the soft part and spit out the hard part. So we shouldn't study like that and just take the easy stuff and spit out the hard stuff and say, it's too difficult, I can't learn it. Yeah, things like this. Because if we can become a Buddha, then we can definitely learn this. So it just requires putting in that energy. So I thought it might be good to review a little bit. I've been to Australia and back. You guys have had continuous classes, but I've been around the world. So I thought a little bit of review also because, this topic that we're getting into is a little bit, maybe a little bit more complicated, or maybe it's that the terminology is different. Some of the ideas are exactly the same as we've had before, but he's putting the terminology different. So I want to start at 6844, which I know, and you tell me what pages. I go, what? So now I'm telling you the location, and you go, what?
Did you give us a phrase that was supposed to be?
Pardon me?
Did you give us a phrase as well?
Yes, I was planning on doing that. Okay, so it's, I was thinking to start where it says syllogisms are the basic argument form. If you look in terms of things that are indented, you'll see one indented phrase, all consciousnesses are valid cognizers. So I'm going back a little bit into chapter 22.
Page 339.
339? Okay. Okay. So I'm not sure that I'll read everything from here, but at least to review some of these basic ideas. Okay. So syllogisms are the basic argument form, and the type of consequence stated in Buddhist debate is modeled after syllogisms. The two argument forms are structurally similar, however, there is also a wide gap between them. So this is quite important, understanding the differences between syllogism and consequences. So valid syllogisms express the natural state of phenomena, and the person who states a syllogism is personally responsible for the argument, right or wrong. Okay? On the other hand, when consequences are used as arguments that reflect the positions put forth by others, the person giving voice to the consequence is not held personally responsible for the truth or falsity of the argument, only that it has to be a fair implication of what the person said. Then I was going to skip a few paragraphs and go to where it says, since syllogisms and consequences are structurally similar, the parts are thought of in largely the same ways, and the parts are related in the same ways to form the premises. However, in a syllogism, the quality in the second position is the predicate to be proven as a quality of the subject. That is the point of the argument. But in the case of a consequence, the quality in the second position is known as a clarification or a point of clarification. That is the purpose of a consequence, to clarify whether or not the quality in the second position is a quality of the subject. In the case above, the one stating the consequence is trying to make clear that being a valid cognizer is not a quality of a wrong consciousness. Okay, so that was from the example on the preceding page, where someone says all consciousnesses are valid cognizers. Someone says that. Then, if you're going to throw a consequence, you would say, then it would follow that the subject, a wrong consciousness, is a valid cognizer because of being a consciousness. You stated the pervasion. Okay? So a syllogism is introducing kind of what you want to prove to that person, maybe bringing them into new material, but a consequence is being based on what that person already said and what they supposedly believe, and asking them to clarify if this really makes sense, if what they're saying really makes sense. Okay? So a consequence is often used to help somebody see the falsity in what they're saying and jar them from their stated position, whereas a syllogism is used to introduce them to a new position and prove that new position to them. Okay? And then, part of the debate between the Svatantrikas and the Prasangikas, because the Prasangikas in Prasanga means consequence and Svatantra means autonomous syllogism. Part of their disagreement is once you throw a consequence and you show somebody that what they believe is wrong, do you necessarily then have to state a syllogism to show them the correct view, or is throwing the consequence enough by helping them see their position is wrong, to see the correct position. Okay, so that's one of the points that they have some debate about. Another point is that the Svatantrikas state that there's commonly appearing subjects. So for them, the subject of a syllogism, like a pot or whatever it is, appears in the same way or is apprehended in the same way by everybody. And the Prasangikas say no, because, ignorant people are apprehending the pot as truly existent. And the Svatantrikas say that is, how it is. So it's a commonly appearing subject, and that's the object that exists. And what you're debating about concerns this truly existent pot. And the Prasangikas are saying, no, you can't say that the subject is a truly existent pot. Okay? Because we're refuting, or I should say inherently existent. Yeah? So you can't say it's an inherently existent pot, because what we're refuting is that inherent existence. Okay? So you can't assume that that all the parts of your syllogism or your consequence are all inherently existent. So anyway, they have a lot of debate about that. It gets quite technical, and it's a big section in Tsongkhapa's, in the Great Lam Rim, in Volume 3. It's a huge chapter about Svatantrikas and Prasangikas and commonly appearing objects and how they debate. And when I read it, I thought, okay, the only thing I understand here is pot. Yeah, that's it. And but it was slightly comforting. I was talking with Betsy Napper about it one day, and she said, well, even the Geshis have a really hard time with that part. So I thought, okay, but it gets into the real subtleties of the argument. Okay, so it's just helpful to know that there's some debate about all of this, and Okay, so that in the syllogism, the quality in the second part is what you want to prove. In a consequence, the thing in the second part isn't the predicate that you want to prove, it's the thing that you want to clarify. Okay. So to continue on there, the main reason for the predominant reliance on consequences in Buddhist debate is that they are much more effective in bringing a person to a new understanding. If a person asserts a faulty position, a consequence that is a fair reflection of those views is able to force the person to see the unwanted implications and to overcome misconceptions. You are meeting the person on his or her own grounds. Rather than trying to school a person with the logic of syllogisms, it can be more effective to use terminology and assertions that the person already accepts. And then you show how what they accept doesn't make sense. Okay, so it's going about it in a different way. Also, they say that in order for somebody to adopt a new view, they have to have refuted their old view that contradicts the new view. Okay, so that's why we have so much debate between the Vaibhasikas and Satantrikas and Chittamadrans and Madhyamakas, and among the Madhyamakas between the Svatantrikas and Prasangikas, because what you're trying to do is deflate and refute the views of the lower schools. You have to do that before you introduce them to the views of the Prasangika and to non-inherent existence. Okay? So if somebody's holding tightly to everything's inherently existent, if you just say, oh, but the pot is not inherently existent because it's a dependent arising, that doesn't hit them as much. They have to, you have to get them out of that thing of grasping so hard to their own view that everything is substantial. Okay, so the consequences help to do that. So in trying to do this, so use the terminology and assertions that the person already accepts. It would be like, okay, if you take yourself. Let's say you grew up with a lot of Christian theology, and you come to Buddhism, and you still believe in an absolute permanent creator. And then Buddhism says, no, it's our mind that is the creator. There's no external thing that creates. If you're holding on to this idea of, but God created me and God is responsible for everything that happens, and that's why I pray to God. If somebody just comes and says, well, there's no God and it's all karma, and the state of your mind and your afflictions, that they're not going to understand, because you're talking about, something that's totally foreign to them. Whereas if you talk in terms of a consequence, and you use the terminology that they're used to, and you show them how a permanent creator cannot exist, then they can abandon that view, and that gives them mental space to adopt another view. Okay? So although we're talking here like we're doing this to opponents and trying to change their mind, actually the real opponent is ourself, and our own, afflictions and wrong views. So that's one of the reasons why I often remind people, that those of us who didn't grow up Buddhist, that we have a whole stock of assumptions, of wrong ideas, of all sorts of stuff that we don't even realize we have, because it's so ingrained, and that's the way it is because that's the way everybody thinks. Like I keep telling you, when I went to Nepal, and well, everybody's got to be for democracy and think democracy is the best system, and I didn't even know I thought that until I started meeting people who didn't like democracy and had very good reasons for wanting His Holiness to be in charge. So so we have to, in ourselves, really bring to light the different assumptions and preconceptions we have, and not be afraid of doing that. And then look at them squarely and say, does that make sense? Can things really exist that way? Can that really be so? Okay, so it takes some courage to challenge our old views, doesn't it? And we have lots of old views about all sorts of things. So, of course, the most important ones are the philosophical views, but we have, even other views that are big stumbling blocks for us. Sometimes, you've gone to school and you've learned certain things. And you studied, I don't know what, you studied, medicine, and you learned A, B, C, and D, and that's imprinted in your mind very strongly. And then you come upon another doctor who sees the situation in a completely different way, and you just say, well, he's wrong. It can't be that. Huh? Or, just even how to handle different situations. How do you handle it when somebody does X, Y, Z? Some of us have been brought up in families where you just avoid conflict, and that's the way it is. And we don't even realize that we've been brought up to avoid conflict until we come across somebody who happens to be very straightforward and says it like it is, and we think that person's being very aggressive. Yeah? But it's not that they're being aggressive, It's that we have an assumption that everybody should act in a certain way or everybody should think in that way, but not everybody does. Yeah? So in some ways we can see, having an education is good. It opens our mind, exposes us to new things. But sometimes we become so rigid in whatever we were educated in that it's hard for us to see things in a different way. Yeah? So, like you have one situation, and one person studied psychology, and they look at the figures in a psychological way. Somebody else studied sociology. They're looking at the institutional ramifications and how the institutions work. Somebody else studied poli-sci, and they're looking at all the politics involved in it. Yeah, and everybody, because of what they learned in their own field, it's like, well, this is the way we've got to react to this situation and deal with this, But they're not realizing that actually there's a whole world with different ways of seeing it and different ways of dealing it. And we clam down. No, you've got to see this. You're a sociologist. You've got to see this through how the institutions work. And the psychologists say, no, you've got to think about it through the psychology of each individual player. Yeah? And everybody's stuck in their own thing. Okay? So, it's interesting when this comes up and we're trying to work with other people, isn't it? And this is actually when there's a time really for very creative exchange. It's like, oh, you studied psych, you studied soc, you studied poli-sci. Let's learn from each other's viewpoints, And then you get in somebody in there who's an evolutionary biologist, and they look at the situation totally different, and somebody who's a neurologist is, investigating it that way. So, if we come to those situations with an open mind, we can really learn a lot from other people and their different viewpoints. But we human beings are so interesting. It's like we want the security of one viewpoint that we know is right. Yeah? Have you ever noticed that in yourself? I just want one viewpoint that is right. And I remember one time, this is so clear, and it's such a good example. One young man came to the Abbey, and he had been studying Theravada Buddhism. So we were talking about Theravada and Mahayana, and I forget what we were talking about. It might have been like who the Buddha was. And he was saying, that the standard thing is the Buddha was born as a prince, and, he was an ordinary being. He attained enlightenment in that one lifetime. And I'm saying, well, in the Mahayana, we see it totally different. He was already enlightened, and then he did this as a way to show an example and a role model to us. And I said, and there's many different views in between that. And he said, just tell me the one right one. Yeah, and I just remember him saying that. I just want to know the one right one. And then I realized that's how I am too. In so many things, I just tell me the one right one. Don't ask me to think too much and examine it. Just tell me what it is so that I have the security of knowing the right answer. But of course, you don't really know the right answer because you haven't thought about it and investigated it yourself. And you haven't thought about all the other things that are, factors in the situation. You're just clinging, it's like, this is the one problem, that if we only solve that. Yeah. So, this way of ours to cling to some kind of certitude really limits us. And it's the source of so much conflict, isn't it? Yeah, so much conflict.
Offering service, we were talking about how, I said, I want the answer, I want the one right view. And Nicole brought up the example of the story of Tara, who is she? And in the book that you wrote, you say that you can see her from different perspectives. Mm-hmm. One is that she was born a human being, a princess, and then she attained awakening. Another is that she's an aspect of enlightened consciousness. Another is that she was born from Chenrezi's tears. Mm-hmm. And I'm like, I just want to know the one. Aren't they mutually exclusive?
Yeah. So that's a very good example. Yeah. And that tells us something about how our own mind works. It tells us more about how our own mind works than about Tara. And studying how our own mind works and figuring that out is much more important than figuring out, how Tara was born. Was she born from a tear? Or was her mother actually pregnant? That really isn't so important. But to look at how our mind thinks, and how much that produces, how much that makes us narrow, very narrow, very rigid, and we have to, I think, be able to see things in a very broad way and many perspectives, because otherwise it's going to be difficult to have compassion for other people who think differently, because our mind automatically goes into judgment form. Yeah, they don't think like me, therefore I am right, they are wrong, they're stupid, they're an imbecile, blah, blah, blah. We brand them, we describe them, we deprecate them, and then we don't listen to them. And then we wonder why we can't communicate with other people. Yeah? And why society is so divided now and polarized, instead of just stepping back and, okay, let's look at this in a big picture and try and see what other people see here, and then evaluate it. Yeah. So syllogisms, according to Dhamma Locha Rinpoche, syllogisms are especially effective for overcoming doubts or uncertainties, and consequences are especially effective for overcoming wrong views. Okay. Reasoning with syllogisms can help a person get it straight. Facing consequences based on your own views can dislodge you from mistaken notion. Okay. So according to the tutor's collected topics, a correct consequence must be such that there is a person for whom it is a correct consequence, and this person must not be able to give a factually concordant response to the argument. Okay. Thus, it is more than just a fair consequence of the person's views. It is a fair and effective response. Arguments do not exist in a void, but are related to persons and their ideas. Consequences are designed to address actual views held to be true. The first requirement is that there must be a person who holds the position that is drawn out in the consequence. If there's not a person who holds that position, then why are you stating the consequence? It's not going to do any good. And second, the consequence must be such that the person to whom it is stated cannot give a factually concordant answer that would defeat the argument. So the consequence must be such that when you say it to somebody, they just go, duh. It's like, oh yeah, what I believe doesn't make sense. They can't give a good answer to it. Thus, the person is forced to understand an implied correct thesis. So here's the side that's saying that you don't also need a syllogism, you just need the consequence. The person is forced to understand an implied correct thesis relating the subject and the point of clarification. Of course, the person may not. They may figure out that answer is wrong, but they may not get the right one quite yet. A consequence to which an opponent is able to give an effective answer, or one that does not address views held by the opponent, is not a valid argument. Okay? So the argument doesn't depend on the structure of the argument and if all the pieces are in place. The argument being valid depends upon if there's a person who holds that position and that person cannot give a correct answer in the face of that consequence. Okay? So just as when we were talking about syllogisms earlier, a syllogism is only a valid syllogism if you're giving it to a person who's capable of understanding it. If the person cannot understand, cannot establish the reason, or cannot understand the pervasion, then the syllogism may be set up perfectly in terms of its structure, but it's not a valid syllogism for that person. And so I may have told you at the beginning when I started studying this, I didn't understand that. So I thought that, okay, you have a syllogism. Somebody, sets out a syllogism. All phenomena are empty of inherent existence because they're dependent arising. And that's perfectly structured. It makes sense, so everybody should believe it. And then I realized, well, no, not everybody does believe it. Now, why is that? It's a correct, valid syllogism. It should just necessitate a person reading it and then they get it. Okay? But that's the whole point, that sometimes we don't get that the reason is a property of the subject. Or sometimes we don't get the pervasion of the argument. And so if we don't understand those things, for us, the syllogism isn't valid. Doesn't prove anything to us. It's kind of like, if somebody's in first grade and you teach them calculus, you could teach them beautiful calculus from the greatest book, but you're not teaching that kid in first grade calculus because they don't even understand any of it. Okay, so kind of like that.
Memorize what you taught.
Right. Even you can memorize. I mean, I say the syllogism, all phenomena are empty of inherent existence because they're dependent arising. Do I understand that? No. But I say it. And I suppose there's some correct assumption somewhere. But I don't really understand that. Even understanding what it means for something to be a dependent arising, that's hard. As in the description of the requirements for a valid syllogism, here again the value of this type of argument is determined by its epistemological efficacy, its ability to cause a person to generate a new understanding. So it must affect the person for it to be a valid syllogism, or Yeah. A consequence is correct or not in dependence on the opponent's level of understanding of the implied thesis. If the opponent doesn't understand the implied thesis, you're talking to the moon.
I think maybe the context is coming into focus, which may be helpful for me.
Mm-hmm.
So in a debate, you have your challenger, you have your defender,
Mm-hmm.
and the defender makes their statement, and the challenger starts back and forth, back and forth, back and forth, and they just keep going and going and going and going and going until the defender says something that they cannot defend. And the challenger then would not use a consequence until they reach a point where they've actually recognized that the defender doesn't have isn't clear about a point, can't defend its point, and that's where the consequence comes in the debate process and the big picture of the whole thing.
Yeah, the consequence is used to show the defender that what he believes is incorrect. So as long as the defender is saying something that is correct, you don't use a consequence.
Right. So they go and go and go and go and go and go and go, and then there's like, oh, that's not right.
Yeah.
And that's when the challenger might work around into a consequence.
Yeah, but sometimes it comes up at the beginning of the debate,
Well,
too.
it would if it were me, but...
No, but even with the other people,
Yeah.
too. It comes up. Otherwise, the debate's not interesting.
Yeah.
Yeah. What makes the debate interesting is the fact that they don't agree. If the challenger asks the defender a question, if the defender says, yes, this, and the challenger says, yeah, I agree, and the defender says, I agree, and then they're not going to debate for more than 2 minutes that way, because that's not a debate. Okay? So what makes it interesting is somebody says something that, makes somebody else think about something that they haven't considered before. Yeah, and then you have to say something quickly. So even though you haven't thought about it much before, you say something, and then the challenger, can start helping you investigate whether what you say is true or not. Okay. So, yeah, they don't sit and scream at each other and push and shout and call each other's names because they agree. They do it because, this guy said this, but, it's about, see, the whole thing is, we think learning is the teacher tells you the information and you remember it. That's what we think learning is. Okay? That's not what they think learning is. They think learning is the teacher or the text tells you a little bit, and then you use your creative ability to put all these pieces together in various ways to see what it's really trying to say and how this whole thing works. Yeah? So it's a totally different way of learning. We just, tell me the answer, and I'll memorize it, and I'll put it back on a test. But don't ask me a question to think about that too much, because I haven't really thought about it much. I've just memorized the answer. Okay? But debate makes you think about it. So he gives us really easy debates, kind of, what is the definition of pot? It's like, yeah, so that's just so we start to understand the structure of a debate. But when they debate, they really get into the meaning of what they're trying to talk about. And so in their form of study, you have to talk. Our form of study, you sit there and smile and wait for the teacher to tell you the answer. And you can see this even in our courses. People were asking me one question after the other. I'm supposed to know the right answer and tell them the right answer in such a way that it answers their question without them having to think for themselves. Yeah? But that's not real learning. real learning is you get some information, then, somebody says something or you start thinking about it, and it's like, well, how does that fit together? I don't understand how that fits. So is it this way? Is it that way? That you have to think about it, you have to discuss it, and it's through that process that then you really learn it. Yeah, learning is not just parroting back what the teacher said and expecting the teacher to provide us with all the answers while we just sit there and, shoot our questions. Yeah, that's really lazy, isn't it? Oh, I have a question here. Here's do you answer all my questions? Yeah, and I'll sit there, and if your answer makes sense, then that's good. But if your answer doesn't make sense, then you're a lousy teacher. Not I'm an insufficient student who's lazy. Okay, so it's a very different way of learning. And if, and I can see that with some of my teachers, if you have a really good geshe, they will get you so confused. Yeah. Geshe Sonam Rinchen would get us so confused. Yeah. They just sit there and laugh. But that's what made us think. Okay. So we just want, even in our day-to-day things with somebody, yeah, somebody says, put the spatula here. We don't think, no, why would it make sense to put the spatula there? We don't even ask ourselves a question and try and understand it. We say, why? Why should I put the spatula there? And we expect them to tell us the right answer without us thinking. Yeah. Whereas if we thought for a moment, it's like, oh yeah, if you put the spatula near the frying pan, you can get to it easily. Okay? It happens on so many different levels. Mm-hmm. So then there's a bunch of exercises. And then we come to 23. So we're still reviewing here, I think. No, did we start 23?
Yes.
We did. Okay. Oh yeah, we did. But we'll just review because I think it's helpful.
Reflecting on my education, particularly in high school, it was just so very much learn it and spit it back out. And a lot of the people in my year were trying to get into med school, and so the grades that they got were so important because it's such a competitive thing. And people were getting tutors to write them their essays that they would then memorize and then regurgitate for the test, because that way they knew that they would get a certain mark. And so this was just the context that I was cooked in. And it's like, yeah, I just need to memorize what I need to do, spit it back out, get the grade, get what I want, and that's it.
Yeah.
There's not a joy in it. There's not a greater purpose. It just suddenly becomes about learn it, spit it back out,
And
get
that's
the grade.
success.
Yeah.
Yeah. That's
And so the whole joy of inquiry or learning to think for yourself,
mm-hmm.
and it's lost, and then it's just becomes about competition.
Yeah, it becomes competition to get grades. Instead of, when you really read something and you start thinking about it, you can put pieces together, then it's really interesting. It's kind of exciting to learn.
Which is so crazy because these people were, a lot of the people we have the tutors, and this was trying to get into med school. You need that critical thinking.
Mm-hmm.
So it's crazy.
Yeah. But this is how society has become. It's not good. Yeah.
I didn't experience my studies the same way.
Oh,
No, we had
okay.
more room for creativity.
Ah.
Let's, for example, I studied family sociology in the second semester, and our task was to figure out how to protect children from internet use that is not helpful for them. And the professor asked us to develop a website and put the information all in, whatever you want, in whatever form. And so we got creative and did interviews and whatever we needed
Yeah.
for that. So I didn't experience the same competitive pressure
Yeah.
in that way. We had group works, a lot of group works.
Yeah. Yeah. A lot of teamwork and working things out. Yeah. And creativity. Yeah. No, she was just memorize, spit.
I was resonating with what Venerable Jampa said because actually, for sure, I think we bring our academic conditioning into our study of Buddhism. And then, but at college in the humanities at the time, there was a lot of emphasis on declaring your lens, which you're like, oh, I am looking at things from a sociological perspective. It was seen as intellectually honest, right? To
I
always,
see.
my professors were always like, okay, what lens are you using to look at this? You need to talk about its limitations, like what conclusions you're drawing. This is a Marxist reading of blah, blah, blah. And to say, and to declare your own position as well. So when I first met the Dharma, I was like, oh, I'm just supposed to take it as fact? Like, wait, where's the context? What do you mean the Madhyamaka is the highest view?
Yeah.
Who said so?
Yeah.
I was
Right.
really struggling with that. And I had been taught the Chittamatra view like fact, right? Confused. Like, where is the social context? Or the teacher saying this is my conditioning? So there was a lot of struggle with faith and confidence in the early years because of that.
Yeah.
Like, they have no critical perspective.
But it's easy to study, Chittamatra or Madhyamaka. You just memorize it, and then it kind of makes sense until somebody asks you a question. Yeah, and then you realize, oh boy, I'm not sure what I believe. I really don't know how this works. Yeah.
I had a little different experience too. In undergrad, it was very much regurgitation, but the minute you hit grad school, it was so different. The courses were based on symposium type gatherings, and you had reading, then you'd bring whatever you absorbed and talk about it, and then to get your degree, you had to write a research project, which took several years, and then you had to defend it to all the professors, and any professor could show up and challenge whatever you said, and have you thought of this, did you think of that? And so actually it seems more like the debate setting, so I see a commonality there.
Yeah. And the recent graduate, what does he think?
I wanted to add also, in high school and primary school,
You had the mic
in
silent.
primary and secondary school,
Uh-huh.
it was a lot of this regurgitation. I think that's what's expected to get the basic degree in Artist Society, which is a high school diploma.
Mm-hmm.
It's just being able to listen to other people and then say what they said and really follow instructions is what you're being taught to do as a high school graduate. But then as a college graduate, I think I also see what Venerable Champa and Tracy are saying in our and the Damcho, that they want you to work in groups, they want you to think creatively. And of course, there's exceptions, like all intro-level courses are still about regurgitation, but as soon as you get past the intro-level courses.
Yeah, then you have to start thinking. Guess you got to go back to school. You are. Here. Let's start with the second paragraph. The first paragraph isn't so interesting. The normal flow of Buddhist debate is something like that too, because the debate it almost always begins with the standing challenger approaching the sitting defender with a question, typically framed as a consequence. So already the way they have it set up, one guy's sitting, one guy's standing, clapping. Already, if you're sensitive, it's like somebody's threatening me. Yeah, they're standing and clapping and asking you questions, and all I do is just sit there. Yeah, so it makes you develop internally too. It's not just the material, but to be able to speak. Yeah, to be able to assert yourself and defend what you believe in, and not just, Yes, I agree. I'm a good girl. Please like me. You know, that isn't going to work. Yeah. You have to say something. The question may be about any of a number of things, including a comparison of phenomena, the interpretation of a word or phrase in a definition, or a passage in a text, or the intent of the passage as a whole. Just knowing that alone helps you understand much of the narrative in traditional Buddhist lectures, because so much of the narrative is about the interpretation of a word or a passage and the distinction between differing views. It's interesting because it's all about interpretation, but you never say that Nagarjuna was interpreting the Buddha. No, Nagarjuna was fleshing out what the Buddha said. Yeah, the great sages don't interpret. They just flesh it out. Yeah, so it's quite interesting here that there's an admission that what we're debating about is interpretation. Because there's a very strong thing in the debate that you don't criticize the great masters. You have to debate it in some way so that what the great master said makes sense, even if it doesn't make sense, because you cannot criticize. And I've often wondered with that if sometimes the statements in the text, because they were doing it with scribes, it's so easy for there to be mistakes in the text. And that maybe they're, debating to try and show how Tsongkhapa said X, Y, Z, when actually the scribe made a mistake and it's X, Y, not Z. Yeah? But you're still debating that, I don't know. I wonder about that sometimes. Yeah? Because very often when you get an oral transmission, they'll stop and correct the text. I guess some points are so obviously wrong that you can add the not. Yeah, but other points, do you add a not? Is this a typo or not a typo?
You mentioned earlier the whole process of debating is to take different perspectives, but then you now say that great masters are not debatable. So how is that? That is contradictory.
Yes. Are you asking me to answer your question for you? Let's have a discussion about how that could be. Yeah? How do you make that happen? Where you validate a differing opinion without saying you're interpreting. I don't know. Think about it. Don't ask me to give you the answer. Okay, because it has to do, with the Tibetan education system. So it would be better to ask, put that on Geshe's list. Yeah, who has the Geshe list, by the way? So anyway, yeah. Oh yeah, His Holiness challenges, but he can challenge. Yeah, because he's the Dalai Lama. Yeah. But other people, but even with His Holiness, in writing the book, His Holiness didn't say this, but the translators and the other Geshis were very clear with me. Unless His Holiness states very clearly a certain position of one of the Yikcha, I shouldn't put in any of the Yikcha's positions as if that were His Holiness's view. The Yikcha are the manuals for the different colleges, the different monasteries. So they all have their own ones. And they're very similar in many ways. But then there's certain things where they disagree, But I was told that His Holiness should not be seen to take sides with any of the yikchas unless he, specifically is saying something and clarifying a position that he obviously feels quite strong about. Yeah. So it's interesting how that works, Like there's this big debate about nirvana. Yeah. And is nirvana or true cessation, is it a non-affirming negation? Yeah. What is nirvana? And there's all these different views. And Panchen Songnam, most people say, oh, nirvana, true cessation is a non-affirming negation. And Panchen Songnam Drakpa says, no. Or, and they debate, is nirvana an emptiness? And some people say yes, and some people say no. So His Holiness will clarify his beliefs on that topic. But on other ones, they said, I can put it in as, some scholars believe this and some scholars believe that, but I shouldn't show His Holiness as taking sides. Unless it's what Tsongkhapa says, then he obviously agrees with that.
What was His Holiness' position
Hmm?
What was His Holiness' position on that?
On nirvana, it's a non-affirming negative, and it's an emptiness. Yeah. It's an interesting thing when you get into it. Anyway, let's go back here. That's a whole... Okay, where were we? Oh, yeah. So just knowing that alone helps you to understand much of the narrative. I read that already. However, unlike beginning with aggression, the challenger's attitude should be respectful, as if really seeking an answer to a troubling qualm. Then, as in the karate forms, the defender has a set of possible answers to the opening debate question. So within these constraints, how does a debater in the role of defender, the one putting forth a view, manage to explain his or her position? Especially when the challenger often starts the thing out. Not always, but sometimes. So George Dreyfus, a.k.a. Geshe Sangye Sandrup, the first Westerner to earn the Geshe degree, has a very rare measure of insight into the actual practice of debate in the Tibetan style. In addition to the usual technique in which the defender lays out a position only by answering the arguments and questions presented by the challenger, he reported, ideally, and it is sometimes done like this, though it is fairly rare, the responder can just state his position. It can be done in a formal way. I know of one case in which someone sat in debate and announced publicly, "This is my position, please come and debate with me." Yeah, so that's somebody who really wanted to figure something out, and he wanted somebody to debate with him. Yeah, but usually it's the challenger who will ask questions, and the defender sometimes is quite limited in what they can say in response. Beginning this way, or by the more usual way of the challengers approaching with a question, the debate proceeds by following these 6 protocols, okay? So usually this is how it goes. So the challenger, this is the one who's standing up, indicates a debate by approaching the defender with a question of some sort, which is framed as an argument. So the challenger doesn't just say, well, what do you think about this topic? Yeah, he states it as some kind of position. Yeah? And then the defender gives answers to the challenger's statements. Since they are all framed as arguments, they may be accepted or denied. Okay? So it's not a discussion. in a discussion like we do here, we build on each other's attitudes or arguments, thoughts. We build on each other's thoughts and assertions to try and figure something out. Whereas this is a specific form where somebody states an argument and you either agree or you don't. Okay? After the defender has answered the challenger's initial statement, the challenger presents arguments one by one in reply to the defender's answers. In these replies, the challenger is seeking to find fault in the defender's answers and to support his or her own line of reasoning. Okay, so then you're going to say, well, what happens if the defender agrees with, or what happens if the challenger agrees with what the defender's saying? The challenger is still trying to pick holes in it because that's how you will really come to a definitive conclusion, is if you try and pick holes from all different sorts of angles. Okay? So it seems like the challenger may agree with the defender, but he's got to be the challenger, so he can't just say, yeah, I agree with you. He has to challenge things. Then 4, if the challenger's line of reasoning does not play out and becomes senseless because the defender gives effective answers, or because the challenger did not think through the argument and possible answers adequately, then the defender does not ultimately contradict earlier statements and would not lose the debate. So the challenger keeps throwing things that maybe they've thought about well, maybe they haven't, and the defender can answer everything. Okay. So then eventually the challenger gives up, and has to agree with the defender. If the defender here's the opposite. If the defender gives up on a line of defense and contradicts earlier statements, the challenger leads the defender back through all the earlier wrong answers, shouting "sa" or "finished" to each contradiction along the way. Okay? So I've often wondered, why don't they just say "sa" at the first contradiction? It may be that because just seeing the first contradiction doesn't undo the defendant's whole argument. It's just part of it, and you still have to refute more kind of stuff to undo the defender's argument. Okay, but sa is where they jump and they clap their hands and they scream at the other guy, and okay. Finally, the challenger poses the original question again, and the defender, who has been shown that the earlier answer is indefensible, now gives another answer contradicting the first. To this, the challenger shouts "sa, sa, sa," signaling that the original answer has been contradicted. So you are finished. Yeah. With the sixth step, that particular debate is over. The defender has abandoned the original position. However, there are lots of ways to go on from there, such as checking the comparison of the principal phenomena in the debate. It will be easier to understand the variety of ways that a debate may begin and what comes after if we cover the defender's answers first. That way, you will be able to get the first part of the debate, not just the opening question, but a snippet of the opening volleys. I think somewhere along the line, we circulated a URL of some of the Inji monks at Sarah doing a debate in English. So it can be interesting to watch that and, how they move around the topic and what they say to each other. Yeah. Okay, so the defender's answers. We are now familiar with the arguments, both syllogisms and consequences, that the challenger can pose. So, what are the defender's possible answers to these arguments? There are two sets of answers depending on the argument that the challenger has stated. Okay, so you can't just say, I don't know, or what do you think, or that depends, or, my lens is. Yeah, you can't qualify what you're saying, to give yourself an out if your argument doesn't wind up making sense. Okay. Have you ever noticed that in discussions, ordinary discussions, how often we give ourselves an out? And I see that in when I'm writing the book, because I have to refer to different sources. Whenever they say in general, they're giving, you give yourself an out. So you're making a statement, you're not 100% on it, but so you say in general. And then if somebody finds an exception, you said, well, I didn't contradict myself because I just said in general, it's like that. Yeah, I didn't say it's always like that. Yeah. Okay, so there's two sets of answers depending on the argument that the challenger has stated. It is not a matter of whether or not the challenger states something in the form of a syllogism or in the form of a consequence that prompts the different sets of answers. The only thing that determines which set of answers to draw from is the structure of the challenger's argument, whether or not it is a complete argument with a reason or whether it's just a statement. Okay, so that is going to determine how you respond. Okay, whether the challenger says has two parts or whether it has three parts. If the challenger states the stem of an object, a point of an argument, a subject and a point of clarification of a consequence without a reason, the defender goes to a set of just two possible answers. Yeah, it doesn't give you much choice. If the challenger states a full three-part consequence, or a syllogism, one with a subject, a point of clarification, and a reason, the defender goes to a set of four possible answers. Understand that very often the opening volley from the challenger is not a stem of an argument so much as a question framed in the terminology of a consequence. Okay? So the challenger isn't always stating an argument with a foolproof reason. Maybe they have a question in their mind, and they're putting forth the question as, a consequence, a statement with just two parts. What he's calling the stem of a consequence. In addition to these two sets of answers, there is always an optional response that denies that a reliable answer can be given. Okay, so you can't say, the challenger says something. Like I said, you can't say, well, it depends. And you can't say, wait a minute, we got to talk about something else first. There's two answers. Yeah? And you got to choose. To a two-part consequence with a subject and a point of clarification. As you recall, a point of clarification is the predicate portion of a consequence. For instance, a challenger might give the stem of a consequence without a reason. It follows that the subject, a pot, is a permanent phenomena. Okay? So that's just a stem. It has the subject, and if it were a syllogism, we would call it a predicate. And those two together would be a thesis. But in debate, they're saying you have the subject and then the point of clarification. So what you want to clarify is the pot a permanent phenomena? Okay. So the defender has just two possible answers. These have the force of disagreement or denial, and agreement or acceptance. So that makes sense. You even say, yes, I agree, or no, I don't agree. Okay? So, first answer is why. Okay? So, formulated in general, why does that subject have the quality of that predicate of the consequence? Okay? Or formulated with numbers, why does 1, the subject, have the quality of that 2, which is the point of clarification? Okay? I find it's easier to say, why does 1 have the quality of 2, or why is 1 a 2? Something like that, whatever it is that you're trying to prove. So when you say why, it comes here, he'll explain, but it generally means I don't accept what you said. Yeah, and so you're asking the challenger to explain why they said that. How does what they say make sense? Okay. The other response the defender can give is, I accept it. So formulated in general, I accept that the subject has the quality of that predicate of the consequence. Or formulated with numbers, I accept that that 1 has the quality of that 2. Okay? Of course, to the above stem, the correct answer, according to the collected topics tradition, is disagreement or denial. Because if somebody says it follows the subject of pot is a permanent phenomena, are you going to say, I agree? No. Okay? So the defender would say, why? Which means, why is a pot a permanent phenomena? Scholars in the tradition always explain the why answer as meaning no. Okay? Still, it seems that the answer could simply be seeking more information, as is usual for why in normal conversation. However, the reason they consistently gloss this as no may be because the defender already knows the reason that can be given. Okay? So, in this kind of thing, somebody says, a pod is a permanent phenomena. And you say, why? Okay? So, it means, no, I don't agree. And, what's the challenger going to say? Yeah. How's the challenger going to defend a pot being a permanent phenomena? Okay? So if the defendant kind of already knows that the challenger is going to be stuck, then why actually does mean no. It isn't asking for new information. But if the challenger said something that sounds like a really interesting new idea, but the defendant doesn't really understand it, then he could say no, or he could say why, and then have the challenger have to explain why he said that, in which case the defender would learn something. Okay. An easy example of a consequent stem to which the correct response would be I accept is the following. It follows that the subject, a pot, is a functioning thing. Okay, so, if you know that and they know it, you say yes. Yeah. If you don't understand that, then maybe then you say why. you know. And then the challenger says, "You dodo? Didn't you study this already?" Okay. Huh?
Is that debate talk?
Oh, sometimes they call each other names, you bet. Yeah. They call each other's names, they scream at each other. They get really worked up with this. Actually, in some of the written texts, too, I forget what it was, what I was studying. Maybe you've come across this, Stu? Yeah. Yeah.
I mean, don't they say that, calling somebody an animal name, you create the karma to be born as that
As an
animal?
animal? Yeah. And then but sometimes, they do call the people from the other traditions names like that. And I remember that was going on. One thing we were studying with Geshe-la and Dargi, and we said, "But Geshe-la, this is so rude, and these people are supposed to be compassionate. How come they're talking to each other like this?" And Geshe-la said, "They're doing it with compassion. They use that language to get the other person to really think about what they're saying. Yeah, instead of just." If you're rude, then maybe they'll think about what they're saying more than if you're polite. Yeah, so maybe, ancient India, the debate culture, could be very different than, very different rules of what's polite and impolite.
I remember one time when we were studying with Jeffrey, you might remember, because he's translated so much of Jamang Shepa, and he's just spent so much time with him, and at one point he was so frustrated with him because he was so mean to saying these derogatory marks towards somebody that he thought was. I think Jeffrey was so into it, he just thought he couldn't bear that he was talking this way about somebody.
Okay, so the formulas for the answers using the numbers 1, 2, and 3 as appropriate rather than the subject, that predicate, or that subject, that predicate, and that reason, are much more helpful for newcomers learning the defender's answers because they allow us to skip a step in our thinking. Although it may seem automatic for old hands to know the position of the subject, the predicate, and the reason, it is not automatic for newcomers. So when given the information that the answer "I accept" means I accept that the subject has the quality of that predicate of the consequence, a newcomer has to pause a moment to reflect on the positions of the two players. It must have been true as well for us in the distant past that we had to think a moment to line up the numbers 1 before 2 and 2 before 3. Maybe when we were little kids, and so on. But it is no longer true for anyone reading this book. Thus, it is just easier initially, and we quickly transcend the need for the numbers. So note well, the comments above and the 2 possible answers are in regard to a case where the challenger has stated a point of clarification, which is part of a consequence. If the challenger states a syllogism thesis, the first 2 parts of a syllogism, to a defender, the expectation is not that the defender will give one of the 2 answers above, but that the defender will supply a reason justifying the thesis. So, in that, it makes me wonder, that other example, it follows the subject of pot is a functioning thing. Why would he just say, "I accept"? Doesn't he have to supply the reason? Yes, I accept the pot is a functioning thing because it's impermanent.
It has a consequence.
By saying it follows that the subject, because the syllogistic format would say, take the subject, or concerning the subject, a pot, it is a functioning thing. Whereas, saying it follows that the pot is a functioning thing. That is the form of a consequence. Okay. Mm-hmm. Remember that in this system, a valid syllogism is an expression of a natural state of phenomena, not just words or even words in the right order. Thus, when the challenger states the first two parts of the syllogism, the defender is called upon to give a correct reason. This happens only when the challenger is following up on something the defender has already said. It is a way of getting the defender to justify claims. Yeah, so it's making the defender explain themselves.
So then the defender would say, I accept that the pot is a functioning thing because that I'm confused when they get this 1, 2, 3. What's an example of how this would unpack?
Okay, so in terms of that consequence, it follows that the subject, a pot, is a functioning thing. The pot is number 1. Number 2 is a functioning thing. And if there are a reason, that would be number 3. So he's just proposing an abbreviated way to look at it, so that you don't need to think, the pot, what's the subject? Oh, it's the pot. What's the point of clarification? Oh, yeah, it's the functioning thing, but so that you could just, it's a tool. Yeah. Okay. Then to a 3-part consequence, complete with a reason. So here you're not just getting a stem, but you're going to get the whole thing. When a challenger states a full consequence with a subject, a point of clarification, and a reason, such as, it follows that the subject, a pot, is a functioning thing because of being a product. Okay? So consequences don't always have to be contradictory. He's just trying to get the defender to clarify what he thinks. So if the challenger says that, and there it has the 3 parts, the defender goes to the other set of answers. These are the 4 answers together with their formulas. So the first response you can have is the reason is not established. So it's like if you're checking a syllogism, what's the first thing you check? To see if the reason's established, if the reason is the property of or pertains to the subject. Okay? So here's, the first thing you say is the reason is not established. So formulated in general, it's the reason that subject has the quality of that reason is not established. Okay? So here, in this, it would be tantamount to saying a pot does not have the quality of being a product. Okay? Formulated with the numbers, the reason that 1, the pot, has the quality of that 3, being a product, is not established. Okay. Then another answer, so this is, like when you're checking a syllogism, that's the first thing you do. Second thing you do with a syllogism is you check the pervasion. So here, in this consequence thing, is another choice you can say. You do have I accept it, that's the last choice. But here, the choice is there is no pervasion. So formulated in general, it is not the case that whatever is that reason necessarily has the quality of that predicate of the consequence. So formulated with numbers, you can see it's easier. It is not the case that whatever is that 3 necessarily has the quality of that 2. It's just another way of saying it that's easier. So here, if you said that with this argument, you would be saying, if you said there's no pervasion, you would be saying that everything that is a product is not necessarily a functioning thing. But that's wrong. Okay, then the third answer you can give is the pervasion is opposite. This is actually a subcategory of the second one, except it makes it much clearer. It's a much clearer response. Alternatively, it is a contradictory pervasion. So instead of saying the pervasion is opposite, you could say it's a contradictory pervasion. So formulated in general, whatever is that reason necessarily does not have the quality of that predicate of the consequence. Formulated with numbers, whatever is that 3 necessarily does not have the quality of being that 2. Okay? So it's again saying there's no pervasion, but here it's not just saying there's no pervasion, it's saying what you're saying is what you're putting forth is the opposite of actually what's true. So it's a much stronger statement. And then your fourth choice is I accept it. Okay? So here that would be I accept that a pot is a product. Okay, formulated in general, that last one. I accept that the subject has the quality of that predicate in the consequence. Formulated with numbers, I accept that 1 has the quality of that 2. Okay, so you're kind of saying yes, it makes sense. Yeah. So the first of the 4 possible answers to a full argument is the reason is not established, which is the appropriate answer to a consequence such as the following. It follows that the subject of pot is a functioning thing because of being a permanent phenomenon. Now what's wrong with that? What's wrong with saying that? A pot is not a permanent phenomena. Okay. No, it's not pervasion. Yeah, the reason is not established as the property of the subject. Okay? So you always check if the reason is the property of the subject first. Because if the reason isn't the property of the subject, then there's no sense even talking about the pervasion or counter-pervasion. So that's the first thing you do. Okay? So the defender, so it follows that the subject of pot is a functioning thing because of being a permanent phenomena. The defender answers, the reason is not established, meaning the reason that a pot is a permanent phenomena is not established. In other words, the being a permanent phenomena is not a quality of pot. Yeah. Still, wait a minute. So it is clearly true, as the defender's answer claims, that a pot is not permanent. Still, one might think that it would be okay to accept this consequence because it is true that the pot is a functioning thing. Okay, so in this first one, the thesis is true, the pot is a functioning thing. So it's tempting to say, I accept because, well, if the thesis is true, then the rest of it must be true. But that's not a correct assumption, because the being permanent is not a quality of pot. Okay? So still one might think that it would be okay to accept this consequence because it is true that a pot is a functioning thing, that subject is that predicate of the consequence. However, even though it is true that a pot is a functioning thing, here that is not justified because of the bad reason. Yeah, So remember that a correct consequence must be one to which a defender cannot give an effective answer. So here, if you say, I accept, the defender can give an effective answer and say, no, but a pot is not a permanent phenomena. Okay, so this thing is, it's like saying, the spatula needs to be put near the stove because I said so. Yeah. So maybe it's true that the spatula needs to be put near the stove, but because I said so isn't a correct reason. Because I said so has nothing to do with spatula. Okay? Or the spatula needs to be put near the stove because the spatula is square, and so is the stove. Or, something like that. And your spatula isn't square. Okay, so it's not working. Okay, then the second of the four possible answers to a full argument is there is no pervasion, formulated in general as whatever is that reason is not necessarily that predicate of the consequence. Or it is not the case that whatever is that reason is necessarily that predicate of the consequence. This is the appropriate answer to a consequence such as the following. Okay, so it follows that the subject of pot is a functioning thing because of being an established base. So what's wrong with that one? There's no pervasion. Okay, so the reason is established. Why? Because the pot is an established base, okay? But there's no pervasion because whatever is a pot isn't necessarily a functioning thing. I mean, whatever is an established base isn't necessarily a functioning thing. For example, on composite space. Okay? So the defender answers there is no pervasion, meaning it is not the case that whatever is an established base is necessarily a functioning thing. It is true that a pot is an established base. However, there is no pervasion here because there are also permanent phenomena which are established bases, but they're not functioning things. Okay. Once again, and this is not always the case, one might think that it would be okay to accept this consequence because it is true that a pot is a functioning thing. However, even though that is true, here it is not justified because of the bad reason. A defender could give an effective answer, like there's permanent phenomena that are established bases that are not functioning things. Okay, so I think we better stop here. Maybe you've stopped already.
He's not, when he says a defender could give an effective answer, he's not suggesting that an appropriate answer right here would be for the defender to give an effective answer. He's saying that the reason, I'm just checking,
Right.
because we're only looking, there's only four possible answers, and then he says a defender could give an effective answer.
Mm-hmm.
But that doesn't mean that the defender will give an effective answer. It means
No,
that
if both the defender and the challenger realize that what is being said is absurd, then I don't think the defender would necessarily, give that answer. But if both the challenger and the defendant didn't realize that, then the defender might have to say, they have to support why they said no pervasion.
Oh, they do. Okay.
Yeah, I mean, you can't just say, oh, there's no pervasion, because maybe the challenger doesn't see that, or the challenger doesn't accept that. So you have to support if you say no pervasion, you have to say why not. Like I just asked you guys, why
He
not?
says there are only 4 possible answers. It
Yeah.
doesn't mean literally you can only say these 4 things. It means you say these 4 things and support what you say.
Yeah, right.
Okay.
Yeah. So if you say, there are permanent things that are established bases but are not functioning things, that's still under the outline of saying there's no pervasion. It doesn't mean that all the defender can say is there's no pervasion, and then they just sit there, duh.
That's all they would say until they were questioning him. Right? That's how I understand
They haven't gotten as far in the book. Listen to opening volumes.
Yeah. If the challenger didn't agree, the challenger, could then fire back. I mean, that's why I said to her, if both of them know that, there's no pervasion, that if something's an established base, it's a functioning thing, then nothing more needs to be said. But if the challenger doesn't accept that, then he could say, well, why not?
But you could also just check.
Also check to make sure that person understands why there's no pervasion.
Yeah.
too.
Yeah. But on some of the simple things, they wouldn't check because they
the point
both
I was
know.
making is that the point I'm making is that really there's this structure of you just answer the bare bones of what that person has asked you. You don't give the extra, why is there no pervasion, but rather you wait for the challenger to question you for that.
Yeah, unless you like to talk, and then you can, and then you can say it. I don't think there's any rule that says you can't.
Actually, there is. At least this is how it was demonstrated to us at, where I learned, is that people would say no pervasion, and they would start to give their answer, and then they would be cut off by the geshe, like, no, I just asked you for, the first response.
Uh-huh.
So,
And then the geshe would say, ask another
if that's
question.
where they were taking the debate, then yes. But when someone gives you a syllogism, you just give, that's my understanding, you just give the bare bone answer, and you wait for them to direct the debate.
Okay.
I mean, I'm sure there are many ways to do a debate, but that's...
Okay. Yeah. I don't know.
I'd like to throw a consequence to you. Is that okay?
Uh-huh.
Okay. This is based on a conversation we had in the car a few weeks ago. So we were driving past a place close to where our friends, the Millers, used to live. And I made the comment that I was grieving the fact that the Millers had moved away. And so Venerable Children said something like, well, you can't expect old hippies to live in the same place forever. So here's the statement. Here we go. All old hippies are not going to live in the same place forever. So it follows that the subjects, 6-year-old Sage and 4-year-old Cora Delaloi, are old hippies because they moved from Missoula to Whitefish.
No, I don't think that's quite it.
The scary consequence of that.
Yeah.
What is it? All old hippies, that was a consequence. Will not live in the same place.
It's forever, yeah.
Yeah, so it follows that the subject, Venerable Thupten Children, the old hippie's not going to live at Sravasti Abbey forever.
Yeah.
That's terrifying. Yeah. I do not accept.
Okay, I'm out of here, you guys. Yeah, you wouldn't start talking about, Cora and Sage. Because that's presenting another argument.
But they move.
Yes, but we're talking about old hippies here. We're not talking about people who move.
I understood it anyway.
Okay.
An old hippie or
Yeah, but the subject is an old hippie. It's not a young child. So you have to formulate what you say so that it pertains to old hippies. Okay? Not to young kids.
All right.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. If somebody said, whoever moves is an old hippie, then you could say, well, Kara and Sage must be old hippies because they moved, yeah. But otherwise, you wouldn't bring them in, okay? Okay. So I think this review is helpful. Do you find it helpful?
Yes.
Yeah, so some of these things, it's really good if we, go over a few times to kind of, as my mother would say, get them through your thick skull. So,